Welcome to a journey back in time to the turbulent years leading up to the American Revolution. Picture a time when the 13 colonies were under British rule, a period of relative tranquility and prosperity. It was an era when the colonies flourished under the umbrella of the British Empire, enjoying the benefits of international trade, protection and economic stability. In this landscape, the American colonies were not just surviving, but indeed thriving. But beneath this veneer of peace and prosperity, a storm was brewing. The colonists, though prosperous, were growing increasingly dissatisfied. Their grievances, though seemingly minor at first glance, gradually transformed into a deep-seated resentment against their distant rulers across the Atlantic. These grievances would eventually ignite the spark of revolution. Yet, the seeds of discontent were already sown, setting the stage for a historic upheaval. Our first stop is the French and Indian War, a crucial catalyst for the revolution. This war, fought between 1754 and 1763, was essentially a territorial squabble between Britain and France, but its effects were far-reaching. While Britain emerged victorious, the cost of triumph was steep, plunging the empire into a sea of debt. In an attempt to recoup their losses, British officials turned their eyes towards the American colonies. The colonies, seen as beneficiaries of the war, were expected to shoulder some of the financial burden. And so the seeds of resentment were sown. New taxes and trade restrictions were imposed on the colonies, and whispers of discontent began to circulate. The colonists, who had fought alongside the British, felt the sting of their mother country's financial desperation. They were being asked to pay for a war they hadn't requested, in a land they considered their own. The war ended, but the financial burden it left behind was just the beginning. Enter 1764, a year that saw two significant acts, the Sugar Act and the Currency Act. The British Crown, eager to recover from the financial wounds of the French and Indian War, turned to the American colonies as a source of revenue. The Sugar Act, a tax on molasses, was meant to regulate trade, but instead it hit the colonial economy hard, especially in New England, where molasses was a key ingredient in rum production. Then came the Currency Act, prohibiting the colonies from issuing their own paper money. This act was a double blow. Not only did it constrict the colonial economy, but it also underscored the lack of colonial representation in British Parliament. The result? Widespread anger and a growing sense of alienation. The economic strain was becoming unbearable, the political frustration intolerable. The colonists' cry, "No taxation without representation," was starting to resonate. 1 year later, the Stamp Act added fuel to the fire. It was 1765 and the British Parliament passed a law requiring all legal documents, newspapers and even playing cards in the American colonies to carry a tax stamp. The reason? To help pay off the debt from the French and Indian War. But the colonists weren't having it. They saw the Stamp Act as a blatant abuse of power. No taxation without representation became their rallying cry, emphasizing their belief that they should not be taxed by a government in which they had no voice. The colonists' outrage sparked organized resistance. Boycotts of British goods spread like wildfire, and protesters took to the streets, forming groups like the Sons of Liberty. The tension was palpable, the colonists' defiance tangible. The Stamp Act was eventually repealed, but the damage was done. The colonists had tasted rebellion, and they liked it. The stage was set for confrontation, and the Boston Massacre would soon follow. In 1770, the tension exploded into violence with the Boston Massacre. It was a frigid March evening when a dispute between a British soldier and a colonial apprentice ignited a spark that would set aflame the American Revolution. An angry mob formed, hurling insults and snowballs at the British sentry. Reinforcements arrived, but the crowd only grew more aggressive. In the ensuing chaos, the soldiers, fearing for their lives, fired into the crowd, killing 5 colonists. Among the dead was Crispus Attucks, a man of African and Native American descent, becoming the first casualty of the American Revolution. News of the massacre spread like wildfire throughout the colonies. Paul Revere's engraving depicting the event as a brutal slaughter by the British soldiers further inflamed the public sentiment. The Boston Massacre, as it came to be known, symbolized British tyranny and oppression in the eyes of the colonists. The massacre shocked the colonies, pushing them closer to open rebellion. 3 years on, the Tea Act brewed a storm in a teacup, leading to the infamous Boston Tea Party. The Tea Act was passed by the British Parliament in May 1773, with the aim to save the struggling East India Company from bankruptcy. It allowed the company to sell tea directly to the colonies, bypassing colonial merchants and undercutting their prices. However, this act was not about tea, but about the principle of taxation without representation. The colonists saw this as another attempt by Britain to assert control, and they responded with defiance. On a chilly December night that same year, a group of colonists, disguised as Native Americans, boarded 3 ships in Boston Harbor. They dumped 342 chests of tea into the water, a rebellious act that came to be known as the Boston Tea Party. This was not just a protest against a tax on tea, but a bold statement of resistance. The Boston Tea Party was a clear declaration. The colonists would not be subdued. In response, Britain enacted the Intolerable Acts, tightening its grip on the colonies. These laws, also known as the Coercive Acts, were passed in 1774 following the infamous Boston Tea Party. These were not acts of kindness or reconciliation, rather punitive measures meant to reassert British authority over the colonies. There were several key components to these acts. The Boston Port Act closed Boston Harbor until the East India Company was reimbursed for the lost tea. The Massachusetts Government Act stripped Massachusetts of its self-governance, placing it firmly under British control. The Administration of Justice Act essentially gave British officials immunity from colonial law, and the Quartering Act coerced colonists to house British troops. The Intolerable Acts were not just punitive, but they were also provocative. The harshness of these laws united the colonies in their opposition to British rule, fostering a shared sense of injustice and rebellion. The Intolerable Acts were a tipping point, turning simmering unrest into a full-fledged revolution. In 1774, the First Continental Congress convened, marking a turning point in American history. This Congress was not a government, but a meeting of minds, a gathering of 56 delegates from 12 of the 13 colonies. They met in Philadelphia in a building we now know as Independence Hall. The air was thick with anticipation and uncertainty, but also resolve. Their goal? To address the colonists' grievances against British rule. They discussed, debated, and eventually drafted a list of complaints known as the Declaration of Rights and Grievances. It was a daring move, a united front against the British Crown. The First Continental Congress played a pivotal role in uniting the colonies. It set the stage for a larger, more organized resistance and laid the groundwork for the Second Continental Congress, which would eventually lead to independence. The colonies were now united in their resolve, and the American Revolution was imminent. In April 1775, the first shots of the American Revolution were fired at Lexington and Concord. This marked the outset of a long and grueling conflict that would change the course of history. The British, aiming to seize the colonists' weapons stockpile, marched towards Concord. However, their plan was no secret. Thanks to the efforts of Paul Revere and others who sounded the alarm, the local militia, known as Minutemen, were ready to resist. At Lexington, they faced off against the British. The encounter was brief, but it was the spark that ignited the powder keg. Shots were fired, lives were lost, and the war had begun. The British continued to Concord, but were met with stronger resistance and were forced to retreat. This confrontation was not only a significant military event, but also a powerful symbol. It marked the moment when peaceful protest escalated into armed conflict. With the shots fired at Lexington and Concord, the American Revolution had officially begun. And so a revolution was born out of a series of events that changed the course of history. From the French and Indian Wars' economic strain to the Sugar and Currency Acts that provoked ire, the seeds of revolution were sown. The Stamp Act's taxation without representation sparked fiery protests, while the Boston Massacre demonstrated the potential for tragic escalation. The Tea Act and the consequential Boston Tea Party highlighted the colonists' refusal to be passive. The Intolerable Acts further fueled the revolutionary spirit, leading to the First Continental Congress, a unified response to tyranny. The Battle of Lexington and Concord finally marked the point of no return. Each of these milestones, these causes of the American Revolution, played a crucial role in shaping a nation committed to liberty and justice. They remind us that change often comes with struggle, and freedom is a prize worth the fight. If you enjoyed this journey through history, do subscribe to our channel and give this video a thumbs up. Stay tuned for more fascinating insights into our past.